just go ahead. What the hell is going on with Iran talks? I think we're in round number 8 here,
Yeah,
and maybe, just maybe, a hopeful note.
I think so. So where we left off last week, we were really talking about how there's a big discrepancy and a mismatch in the rhetoric on, say, the American side versus and the Europeans and the way they talk about where negotiations stand. Certainly the Israelis, but I mean, it's all sort of a part of it, but at the same time, we're talking about the real participants. So the Americans and the Europeans have been saying, oh, and I mean, of course, the Americans are indirect, but uh, ever present. But they say that Robert Malley came out and talked to CNN on Tuesday. I think the latest news I had last week was that they were saying that Malley had come out and said at some point in the not so distant future we'll conclude that the JCPOA is no more and we'll have to negotiate a whole new different deal, and of course we'll go through a period of escalating crisis. So, but I noted that in Dave DeCamp's piece that we had gone over that the Iranians were singing a different song. They were saying that, look, the parties have agreed on 2 new texts, and as a result of intense discussions in recent days in Vienna, these are documents in which Iran's position has been taken into account on the basis of which we can continue future discussions. And I'll get that was the foreign ministry spokesman Saeed Khatibzadeh of Iran. I'll get to that more here in a moment. But just to say that the 7th round of talks was very pivotal because, as we'll see, the Iranians are now negotiating essentially on their terms, which is very different because as much as the Europeans kept coming out, and I think they were saying things, we were talking about how they were saying like, oh, the JCPOA is being hollowed out. The French just came out and said something like that as well, that the substance of the JCPOA is nearly gone. And the rhetoric is really that, well, they continue it. They imply the way they say it that it's as if Iran is building advanced centrifuges right now and increasing uranium enrichment as we speak. And that's simply not the case. But that's an indication to me that the Americans have essentially hit a brick wall and they don't really have anywhere to go further with their rhetoric, and the Europeans are just echoing them. But so shortly after that came out, then we had Jake Sullivan go to Tel Aviv to meet with the Israelis. So I've got a report here from Al Jazeera. U.S. official meets with Israeli PM on Iran nuclear deal talks. And so some of the quotes that came out of the meeting, Sullivan said he came to visit Israel. This was last Wednesday. Right before Christmas, he said that we're at a, quote, critical juncture. It's important that we sit together and develop a common strategy, a common outlook, and find a way forward that fundamentally secures your country's interests and mine, Sullivan said, according to an Israeli government statement. And then Naftali Bennett, the Israeli prime minister, said, what happens in Vienna has profound ramifications for the stability of the Middle East and the security of Israel for the upcoming years. And that's certainly true because, as we've discussed, the Israelis' main interest here is maintaining the, frankly, phony, bogus Iran threat, which is, they're not seeking nuclear weapons. I just listened to Gareth Porter again on the Scott Horton show, the most recent interview, and Gareth doesn't think even if they treat a Parsi as warm before that the strategy of the real hawks here might be to ultimately goad the Iranians out of the non-proliferation treaty and kind of force them into the position where they would have to make a bomb. But he has a lot of reasons to suggest and argue that even under those circumstances, it does not appear that Iran would likely leave the NPT and certainly not try to make a nuclear weapon. It's against everything, all their principles and all their past history. So now, but certainly Israel's interests would be greatly affected because they could not count on the same level of military aid nor the convenient security structure that's that the Americans have kind of set up for them in the Middle East, where it's basically the Israelis and it's codified in the Abraham's Accords to some extent, but they're sort of Sunni Gulf Arab allies. Previously, particularly in the case of Saudi Arabia, something like that, you have certainly a lot of parallel interests. But now we see a lot of those states, whether it's the UAE or Saudi Arabia, and we'll talk about that as well. There's more news on Saudi-Iranian relations, but positive news. They seem to be moving toward warming relations and warming ties and building ties economically and diplomatically with Iran. So that's certainly true. Israel has a lot to lose here. But continuing, the White House said in a statement that the Sullivan had met with El Hulada, who's his counterpart. And now they had the working group that Israel and the U.S. have right now. It's called the U.S.-Israel Strategic Consultative Group. And the quote from the White House statement was, the delegations discussed the need to confront all aspects of the threat posed by Iran, including its nuclear program, destabilizing activities in the region, support for terrorist proxy groups. So the usual thing. But what's most notable here is Sullivan keeps saying now that they're weeks away from there being no deal to be made. So he said, he told reporters he said that we're not circling a date on the calendar in public, but I can tell you that behind closed doors, we are talking about timeframes, and they are not long. So there's further reporting on what went down here in the meetings with the Israelis. Sullivan, this is antiwar.com. He basically, Sullivan is saying that he's presented, or the reports from Israeli media and from Axios, they're saying that Sullivan laid out 3 different scenarios to Israeli officials. One, that a deal is reached within the next few weeks and the JCPOA is revived, which Sullivan doubts will happen. 2, a quote freeze for freeze agreement that would give Iran some sanctions relief in exchange for freezing certain aspects of its nuclear program. And 3, the other alternative would be that negotiations fail and the U.S. implements new sanctions and other pressure on Iran. So I went through here in my notes and I crossed off number 2 because the Israelis have already said that they would not accept the freeze for freeze deal. But more importantly, the Iranians will not accept that. So that's not a possibility. The Iranians want the full implementation of the JCPOA and will apparently settle for nothing less. And I think that's why they do have the upper hand in these discussions in Vienna, because they are sticking to their guns. They have they've stayed in the deal. I mean, we've been through this before, but essentially they have not backed down despite what the Americans, the Europeans, and the Israelis' efforts. And it doesn't appear that the Russians and the Chinese have insisted that they make too many concessions because, again, the interest is here in returning to the deal. And since Iran is the aggrieved party, the Americans reimposed sanctions. The Israelis have been attacking them. They've been adding sanctions even as once the talks restarted. And there have been all kinds of talks about, the Americans and the Israelis practicing bombing Iran and different things of that nature, that the Iranians have basically not expanded their nuclear program in the meantime. They have not, they've done some drills, which I'll get to here after this meeting with Sullivan and the threats from Israel, firing off ballistic missiles and saying essentially that they're preparing to, this is a response to any kind of threats made by the Zionist regime. I'll just talk about that really quick. So after Sullivan's meeting, the IRGC, the Iranian Revolutionary Guard, fired off. They conducted 5 days of drills and fired off 16 surface-to-surface ballistic missiles at the end of the drills. And the generals said that this was a warning to Israel. So the official IRNA news agency last Friday reported that they said the names of the rockets. I'm not sure. I'll probably butcher some of these pronunciations, so I'll just skip them. But their ranges vary between 350 kilometers and 2,000 kilometers, about 220 miles and 1,250 miles. And they specifically said, like Iran's Armed Forces Chief of Staff, Major General Mohammad Bagheri, said these exercises were designed to respond to threats made in recent days by the Zionist regime. They also said that missiles successfully hit one target at the same time as 10 drones simultaneously hit their targets. He said 16 missiles aimed and annihilated the chosen target. In this exercise, part of the hundreds of Iranian missiles capable of destroying a country that dared to attack Iran were deployed. And then, let's see, there was another. These were in provinces which touched the Gulf. Bushehr, Hormozgan, and Khuzestan provinces. The drills were dubbed Great Prophet, Payambar-e-Azam. And then there was another IRGC chief, Major General Hussein Salami, who said, quote, "The military exercise is a serious warning to the Zionist regime officials, or to Zionist regime officials. Make the slightest mistake and we will cut off their hand." And this was in direct response to the threats that have been made recently, and of course the meeting with Sullivan. And so I'll
And
point out.
can
Oh
I
yeah, go
just
ahead.
add here, Connor, and say that the Iranians had long said, especially after the Raisi administration took over in Iran in June or July, that they would not engage in talks kind of at the barrel of a gun, when they were receiving threats. And it's really hard to not interpret what the U.S. and Israel have been doing over the past few months as threatening towards Iran. Going as far as to carry out joint military exercises, probably being like the most major, but also a lot of the talks between like Sullivan and Iran or in Israel and stuff like that are very hawkish, and they always include threats from Israeli officials against Iran, like if you do anything out of line that you're not even planning on doing, we'll kill all of you. And so this, I think, is a way for Iran to probably respond to those provocative actions by the U.S. and Israel without destroying the diplomacy of the Iran deal at the same time. And I'm not trying to give the Iranians too much credit here, but I think that's a line that they're legitimately trying to walk. And I think that this is how they're going to do it. And I think it's important for, as particularly the American audience to understand what Iran is doing in that context, that they have right-wing at-home hawkish pressures as well, and this was a government that came in as a right-wing hawkish government. And so I think that they may feel like this is a way that they're not really doing it. I mean, they are testing weapons, that's not completely insignificant, but they're not taking any actions directly directed at the US or Israel. And at the same time, they are responding, quote unquote, to the rhetoric and the drills of the US and Israel.
Yeah, well, what was it? Shortly before the talks began, you had those joint drills with the UAE, Bahrain, the U.S., and Israel in the Red Sea, practicing essentially pirating ships, stealing as the Americans have done in the past. Again, I totally agree with you. I mean, this is absolutely defensive. The whole ballistic missile program they have in the first place, as much of the hyperbolic propaganda there is about it, it's a defensive response to all the threats they face in the region, namely from the Americans and the Israelis. And the idea that the Americans and the Israelis have been pushing them for so long that they have to have this longer, stronger deal and give those up. And again, we've covered on this show in this year, multiple times there have been mysterious incidents where Israeli ships have been attacked. There have been oil spills off, Israel's coast where they blame Iran, and it's not really clear that Iran was involved. But there hasn't been anything like that. The Iranians, it's often described as there's this sort of tit for tat, back and forth. Israel attacks Iran ships and Iran attacks Israel's ships. Israel hasn't even really gone after Iranian ships since the talks restarted, to my knowledge, yet. It's been more of a diplomatic full court press in this stuff immediately, instead of attacking Natanz like they did in April, the Natanz uranium enrichment facility, or even before, when talks were announced, they attacked an Iranian cargo ship right in the Red Sea. Now, the Israelis in the lead up were, of course, conducting drills, like I said, with the Americans, adding billions of dollars, $1.5 billion. Now it appears it's been increased almost double that, to prepare for attacks on Iran. They resumed testing how they're going to bomb Iranian nuclear facilities and all this kind of stuff. But they have, they just came out and they said it right at the beginning. They go, Iran, we have intelligence that they're seeking nuclear weapons. And Bill Burns, the CIA director, had come out and said a week later that, no, that's not true. And now, actually, notably, the Iranian, and I think the Iranians are very clever too, because yes, they did this drill, but at the same time, they just announced, that the head of the Iranian Atomic Energy Association is saying, no, we don't intend to enrich uranium beyond 60%, which was in response to bring the Americans to the table and to discourage these Israeli attacks. This was after the aforementioned attack on Natanz, which caused explosions and power outages and all kinds of things. So, but they're saying we're never going to increase. He just told Sputnik News, that they don't have any intention to ever exceed 60% enrichment, even if the talks fail. And then he says all our nuclear activities are carried out according to the agreement, statutes, and regulations of the IAEA. Yes, and then also we covered last week that they have now an interim deal, sort of a placeholder deal, to have the IAEA come in and replace those cameras in the Karaj facility that Israel attacked at the end of talks last June, or almost concurrently with their military delegation visiting Washington to discuss Iran. And now they've taken Burns and the Iranians have taken this phony thing about they're racing toward a bomb virtually off the table. That doesn't mean that, because Sullivan was saying to Bennett, he goes, we have a common, what do you say, our priorities are aligned or something. Well, they'll never get a nuclear bomb. So you can say that, but that doesn't really mean anything. The Saudis say it too, and they go, we'll support the JCPOA if it prevents Iran from getting a nuclear weapon. But everybody who's in the know knows that they're not seeking a nuclear weapon, and that even if they were, the JCPOA, they're because they're safeguarded under the IAEA's the non-proliferation treaty. Beyond that, now they have this double triple verification, the most comprehensive and intrusive nuclear inspections regime of a civilian nuclear program in the history of the world. That's what the JCPOA is. And so, of course, it prevents them from getting the thing that they're not seeking in the first place. So it's just more empty rhetoric. But the Iranians have been very strategic diplomatically by saying, hey, we are not seeking the bomb. And look, we're even taking all these complaints from Rafael Grossi and the IAEA about they're not letting us replace the cameras and all this kind of thing. They were able to get the IAEA to condemn the Israeli attack on the Karaj facility, reportedly, which I didn't expect to happen either. So, I mean, they've proven themselves to be quite adept. I'll just say that, and again, the Europeans come out and the French recently said something. I don't have the quote right at hand, but I'll paraphrase. It was, like I said earlier, that though they're advancing their program to the point where there's not going to be any JCPOA left. So the foreign minister of Iran came out and said, we do not see the position of some European countries as constructive, specifically that of France. This was last Thursday. He goes, when they say they are concerned about the progress of Iran's nuclear program, we say out loud, if you want to have your concerns addressed, then all sanctions must be lifted. So before we move on from Israel, I'll just say that the rhetoric has been toned down fairly significantly if you look at what we've been covering the last month or so since talks began. The Israeli president came out and said, notably, he goes, deal or no deal, Iran can never get a nuclear weapon. How do you describe it? Their nuclear program must be neutralized. Okay, but deal or no deal leaves a lot of you can drive a truck through that, because of course the JCPOA is, they're not, it's no one's shutting down Iran's civilian nuclear program. That's not on the table in any case. So, but the fact that he's saying deal or no deal is notable. He says he was speaking at an Israeli ceremony for Israeli Air Force pilots, and he claimed Iran's the top threat in the Middle East. He goes, I'm following the negotiations surrounding the nuclear deal, and I call on the international community not to be led astray, not to underestimate the gravity of the threat. The nuclear threat must be neutralized once and for all, with or without an agreement. Iran must not be allowed to acquire nuclear weapons capabilities. But as I said, that's, I don't know what they really discussed behind closed doors, but the rhetoric is somewhat changing. So then you had Naftali Bennett, who came out and said that he's speaking to Israel's army radio, and he says they would accept a good Iranian nuclear deal, a U.S. return to the JC, like a good deal. Now, he might mean that longer and stronger deal, but frankly, that's better than what we've been hearing. So he goes, for sure, there can be a good agreement. For sure. We know the parameters. Is that expected to happen now in the current dynamics? No, because there needs to be a much firmer position. So he wants them to be stronger. Iran is negotiating with a very weak hand. Now, that's, of course, not true. He goes, but unfortunately, the world is acting like Iran is at a strong point. Now, like I said, that's because they are. The Israelis actually aren't. So the Israelis now, you have current and former officials talking to the New York Times and saying, well, we don't have the bunker buster bombs. We don't have the planes to carry the bunker buster bombs. We don't have the tankers. We have these aging tankers and aging, equipment that it would necessitate us landing in the UAE and Saudi Arabia. We wouldn't be able to just fly to Iran and then fly back. We can't even really do any significant damage to their nuclear facilities because they're too far underground and we don't have the right stuff. And the Americans told them that those tankers, in any case, wouldn't be ready for at least 2 years. So truthfully, the Israelis are running out of options, it seems, unless they, get desperate and they drag the Americans into a war. But I don't really see that happening. In any case, right at the moment. And I'll just say, to your point about them being, restrained, the Iranians, that's the other thing too. Like, people would have thought, and it has come up, like, what is the axis of resistance's strategy going to be during the talks? And my thought has been that I think Iran has, well, I don't know if they have to really make sure of this, to how much they have to enforce this, but I think they're not the axis of resistance is not doing anything at the moment to really disrupt the talks, even to try and benefit Iran, which I'm not sure that would even work in the first place. But it reminds me of previously at the end of the Trump administration when they were getting attacked, the Shiite militias, and threatened, and you had Americans moving military assets more and more into the region, flying B-52s over the Persian Gulf, and all these threats to go to war. And Iran was telling their militia allies in Iraq and elsewhere, Syria, don't do anything too rash right now. Don't attack the American bases. Don't do this because we're waiting for Biden to come in, and then we think we have a real shot at a deal, and things could be better for all concerned. So let's not do anything rash yet. And I think that policy basically still stands.
Can I just add to that real quick, Connor? Because just this week, Iran was seeking to cool tensions in Iraq. Now, of course, thanks to Trump's maybe second biggest Iranian blunder, the assassination of Qasem Soleimani, the IRGC commander, Iran has lost a lot of control that it had over the Iraqi Shia militias. And because of that, American hears that and they're like, oh, good. That's not necessarily the case. Iran wants stability in Iraq. It's a neighboring Shia country. They don't want Shias killing each other. It's not the case that the U.S. and Iran are necessarily on opposite sides here. In fact, the Shia militias took an absolute licking in the October elections. I think they went from 40-something members of the Iraqi parliament all the way down to 17. This is the Fatah parties in Iraq, and they're protesting. They're doing everything they can to try to get the election overturned, and the Iranians are telling them to knock it the hell off. Now, they may not have as much control over the militias and be able to actually stop them as maybe they could have a few years ago, but at the very least, this is the Iranian influence and pressure in Iraq, and I think that's notable and important.
Yeah, absolutely. No, I was just reading that. I was just thinking that that's the only, I can't think of too many other examples right now of any sort of Iranian allies outside the country itself, really raising tensions anywhere other than, Iraq. And again, it's just over their disputes about the election with Sadr. But I think what was it? The Iraqi Supreme Court said that there's not going to be any further challenges, that the elections have been recounted and recounted again, and the results stand. So I don't see that, as you said, absolutely. And yeah, it's very important to note that they do not have, the Americans greatly embellished the influence that Iran still has over the Iraqi militias and even the Syrian militias as well. So so we'll get to this report really quick from Middle East Eye. Saudi Arabia has agreed to issue visas to 3 Iranian diplomats who are going to be serving in the coastal city of Jeddah, at the Organization of Islamic Cooperation, which is a body of 57 Islamic countries. The Iranian Foreign Minister Hossein Amir Abdollahian said that that Riyadh had agreed to grant the visas, and he hinted at some progress as well that's being made. He said that discussions with Riyadh are going well, or had gone well, that the permits were issued last week, and that he added a new round of meetings was expected to begin soon, with arrangements being made for, quote, next steps in the talks. So there's not a lot of details there, but again, just more signs that, of course, they've already Iran has resumed exports to Saudi Arabia, and there's talks of reopening, diplomatic, services and consulates and that sort of thing, among other positive developments between the two countries and other countries in the region, particularly as a result of the talks that were brokered by Baghdad between Riyadh and Tehran. So, and I think that also basically just one more thing that bodes well for the prospects of a return to the JCPOA. Because it means that, of course, Saudi won't be pushing as hard to stop a return to the deal. Now, as far as so Iran was coming out and they were saying that they were very positive about things. They were saying that the important thing is, I'm quoting Bagheri Khani, Ali Bagheri Khani, the lead negotiator in Vienna, who said on Monday that he said after the meeting, he said the officials agreed, quote, good progress had been made during the 7th round of talks that had concluded 10 days earlier. Said the important thing in this joint commission meeting was that different sides emphasized the importance of prioritizing the lifting of sanctions and also verification and guarantees during the 8th round. He says the main thing is they want to be able to sell their oil freely and conduct international banking transactions and enjoy all the benefits of the lifting of sanctions in all economic sectors. He says, he said Iran wants to get to a point where Iranian oil is being sold easily and without any barriers, and its money arrives in Iranian bank accounts. So then we had the U.S. come out, and Ned Price said it's too early to tell if Iran is serious. This is the usual. They're playing the hits again of the last month. Said, quote, it's really too soon to tell whether Iran has returned with a more constructive approach to this round. We are now assessing in the course of these talks whether the Iranians came back with an agenda of new issues or preliminary solutions to the ones already presented. That's kind of convoluted. But Iran and Russia have a very different, like I say, they're singing a very different song. Russia's envoy in Vienna says that there's indisputable progress being made, he said during the meetings yesterday. The Iranian foreign minister previously mentioned said the Vienna talks are headed in a good direction. We believe that if other parties continue the rounds of talks which just started with good faith, reaching a good agreement for all parties is possible. Now, the last couple of things I have are just from these Al Jazeera reports I found about the talks. And let's see. So the main thing that we're looking at here is, I have some notes here. So it's the idea is that they're incorporating their previous demands. So they're basically what's going on now is, as we've talked on the past few shows, that the Europeans did not present a counter proposal. They kept saying that, they're not taking it seriously and we're reaching the end of, our negotiations and there's nowhere to go from here. There's the JCPOA is going to be no more very soon. But the Iranians have been steadfast, and they said that, look, if you have a counter proposal, make it. That's what we're here for. And they've said, we're willing to stay here until we finish the negotiate. We don't have to leave Vienna until the work is done. And so the Europeans, would bluster and say that, basically repeating whatever Ned Price is saying that week. But now, after this last round of talks, it appears that, they put forward early on in the talks I think it might have been in the first week, they put forward 2 joint proposals, one on sanctions relief and one on their obligations vis-a-vis walking back their nuclear advancements beyond the, it's permitted under Articles 26 and 36, but it's, outside. They've increased, built a bunch of advanced centrifuges. They've increased their uranium stockpile, largely because they're not allowed to they can't export it due to the American economic warfare. And they've increased uranium enrichment in cases like, the Tehran medical research reactor, which is largely out of necessity. Under the deal, they wouldn't even have to do that if it was being implemented in any real way. They're supposed to have much easier ways to acquire nuclear fuel than that. And actually, it's an aging reactor. They were supposed to already be replaced. That thing was built in the 60s when the Shah ruled Iran. Now that provides nuclear medicine for like a million patients, I believe, in Iran, where they're experiencing, of course, horrible medical shortages and everything else as a result of the sanctions. And, of course, it was all in response to the Israeli assassination of Mohsen Fakhrizadeh and the American military provocations and increased sanctions, particularly at the end of Trump's administration. And then, as we already discussed, the 60%. So they say we've set aside that June 2021 document, which those two proposals were built on what was discussed in the previous rounds of negotiation, despite the rhetoric from the Americans and the Europeans. But now they say that's even been discarded. They say that we've set that aside. We have a new joint document, and talks will begin today around that document. So the one they had previously said, it was full of brackets, and the Europeans would go, they're walking back on their commitments. They're like, there were no commitments in the first place. That's what Mohammad Marundi, the professor from the University of Tehran, has been saying to international media. He's kind of their point man in Vienna to speak to the international press, that, it's not, what they're saying is not true, that this was never, there was nothing ever set in stone. And as they've said, nothing is agreed on until everything is agreed on. So now, let's see. They also say that they're not concerned about all this talk about how the deadlines are getting closer and closer. On Monday, the previously mentioned IRNA quoted an unnamed source close to the negotiating team, Iran's negotiating team, who said that they don't pay attention to these, quote, fabricated deadlines, and they're prepared to stay in Vienna, like I said, until they reach an agreement, a favorable agreement. And they say, quote, these deadlines won't change our red lines. There is no emergency situation for us in the negotiations. And now I'll just let's see. So the other thing that is important here in the report that came after that is that, let's see. So Enrique Mora, the coordinator for the talks in Vienna, the European Union official who's coordinating and sort of brokering the discussions, he is now sounding more like the Russians and the Iranians. He says that they're in a perfect place right now for something. So it says Enrique Mora, the European Union's coordinator in the meeting, told reporters outside the venue that time is limited due to Iran's nuclear advances, but all delegations wish to end the talks successfully. He says, quote, we have come a long, long way since the beginning of negotiation. We have incorporated sensitivities of a new Iranian government, but from the point of view of the coordinator, we are exactly at the point where we should be if we want to get the final successful result. And I also have Russia's chief negotiator, Mikhail Ulyanov, who's describing the meetings as previously he said that it was indisputably there's indisputable progress, but he says it's businesslike and result-oriented with the aim of achieving an agreement as soon as possible. And he says this 8th round is presumably the final round of negotiations. Enrique Mora also said that if we work hard in the days and weeks ahead, we should have a positive result. It's going to be very difficult. Difficult political decisions have to be taken both in Tehran and in Washington. As far as that goes, it seems like Tehran has the upper hand, but I think what that means is they have to kind of trust to some extent Washington to honor their agreements, and that's a very difficult thing to do, as we already discussed when we were talking about Russia. And the last thing I'll just say is that this is very notable to me that Hossein Amir Abdollahian, the Iranian foreign minister, says that they're moving forward and on this joint document as the basis, and that the joint document is acceptable to the Iranians. And they have been very clear about what their demands are. They want full sanctions relief. They want a guarantee that the Americans won't pull out of the deal again, and they want actually a window to verify sanctions relief as well, which I think is very important because not that the Americans can't reimpose sanctions, but I'd like to see more details on that. But it would be very wise for them to, verify before. In other words, so it's almost like a takeoff on trust but verify. They need to make sure that the Americans are actually lifting sanctions before they roll back their program, because even if they did it concurrently, that could be very difficult too. So we'll have to see more and more what they mean about that. So hopefully there'll be some more details on that, but they're also looking for that window of verification. But essentially that's everything I have. It looks to me like the Iranians, based on what the Iranians and the Russians are saying, I don't know exactly what the Chinese are saying, but I know the Chinese have a big interest in getting this deal having a successful negotiations and a return to the JCPOA in a stable region. They have a lot of interest in expanding their oil interests with Iran. I don't think the push that America intended to make during the talks to get China to stop buying oil from Iran in defying American sanctions, I don't think that got anywhere, to say the least. They don't have any leverage with the Chinese at this point. And so it seems to me from everybody, from what Enrique Mora is saying, the Russians are saying, the Iranians are saying, and the Russians are saying, that talks seem to be going in a good direction. I think the Europeans and the Americans are just playing this up for largely domestic consumption. Hopefully that's what's actually going on. and we talked last week after the show. We stopped recording, and it seemed like I asked you, do you think if the Israelis, in other words, if they return to the deal, if America returns to JCPOA, what would the Israelis do, and what would the Republicans especially do in 2024? Because Ted Cruz has already said, we're going to rip this thing up as soon as we get a Republican back in office again. I think Daniel Larison linked to that in one of his recent articles. And you said, and I think you're absolutely right, that it maybe not as just military aid, but I think it seems like the Israelis, I imagine they're going to demand an increase in yearly military aid, that there'll have to be some new deal akin to what Obama did last time with the when he promised them, $3.8 billion a year. And now this year, I think it was another billion was added to replenish the Iron Dome after they bombed the hell out of Gaza in May. So it might be that, it might, more concessions, but I think if the Israelis can be satisfied with some sort of a bribe, the Republicans will fall in line. What do you think?
Yeah, enough so. You have certain members of the Republican Party who, take their hawkish position against Iran absent of Israel. And so just because the Israeli lobby doesn't, no longer require it, I don't think that means that Ted Cruz, maybe the presidential hopefuls, the Chris Christie types, it'll be interesting to see, like, if Bob Menendez, who's a Democrat, but one of the most anti-Iran deal hawks in the entire Senate, in a powerful position, there are a lot of people that could work to undermine this still. And of course the Israelis, and it just depends on what, we had this week Israel announcing that they're going to double the number of settlers in the Golan Heights, and they're really looking to push a settlement expansion in eastern Jerusalem, and East Jerusalem, and so maybe this is maybe part of what the Israelis are willing to take is the U.S., the Biden administration specifically, not making any objections or any stink about, the Israelis stealing all this land from the Palestinians and the Syrians, in order, for the Israelis not to make a big deal about the Iranian nuclear deal. There's a lot of unknowns because so much of this happens behind the scenes, but I think picking out certain indicators like you are, specifically the Saudis continuing to advance negotiations with Iran. While I may not know what's going on when Jade Sullivan meets with the Israeli top officials like the Prime Minister Naftali Bennett or whoever else, I have a good feeling that Mohammed bin Salman has a better idea of what's going on in those conversations. And if he's looking and hearing what's going on in those conversations and then going to trying to make deals with Iran, that suggests to me that he at least believes that the U.S. and Iran will make a deal. So, Connor, maybe that's a good place to wrap it up today.